Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of ChinaTechChat, the new expert format on business and tech trends in China. This is Bettina, and here's also Kimo and Francis,
Hey,
Kevin Francis. Hi. And we're
Hiya.
delighted to discuss the impact of the lockdowns in China with you today.
yeah, so welcome Kevin on the show. It's great having you here. We already did together a wonderful presentation on the topic for the University of San Diego. So it's wonderful to have you in the discussion room. And just to give like a quick introduction to Kevin Francis, he is our lead analyst at ChineseAlpha. And he before worked at JP Morgan and Citibank, and he has closely investigated zero COVID policy in China and its effect for more than a year, and has a lot of useful background information to share. So, Kevin, like maybe you just give a few little roundup. So, how have you seen the zero COVID situation develop, and can you also briefly explain the underlying principle of the strategy for our listeners?
Hmm. Thank you very much, Kimo, and thank you, Betty, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. So, as many people know, China is essentially running a zero COVID strategy. So, effectively, they're trying to reduce the number of cases as low as possible, ideally below zero. And I guess over the first 18 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, this has been extremely successful, primarily because the Chinese government has acted extremely quickly to the rise in number of cases because they've taken a very data-driven approach. And given that COVID back then didn't have a fast transmission rate, this was actually very effective over that period of time. However, going into the midterm, the problem with this kind of virus is that a virus does not have a vested interest to kill. It has a vested interest to spread as fast as possible. And with new, more transmissible variants such as Omicron, which is becoming more transmissible and less deadly, it's harder to sort of understand whether this zero COVID strategy will continue to work in the future. Again, as the virus becomes more transmissible, it requires more effort from the Chinese government to conduct these lockdowns even more efficiently as possible. Um, I think one big issue for China right now is their vaccination strategy. So, effectively, what China is doing is they're putting the economy first, then putting health second. Fair enough, over the first 18 months, this worked. However, over the last 4 months or so, we've seen Shanghai being locked down, we've seen other districts being locked down, and this presents a huge problem. Why? Because they essentially vaccinated the working class people first. And if you compare that to other countries like Germany, UK, for instance, we vaccinated the elderly first. The logic behind that is if we vaccinate the vulnerable person, we're able to protect them first before moving on to other demographics. China, on the other hand, because they have this rivalry with the US, they want to overtake the US. Their vested interest is to vaccinate the working class people first, which means that their goal is for economic growth, for maximum economic growth, obviously at the potential expense of, potentially the elderly. And this is kind of a dilemma now, which is becoming more and more problematic as the virus is getting more transmissible with, their vaccine not being quite as effective. So that's just a quick rundown of what I feel China is doing, and that's just a rundown on their strategy. So, Kimo, do you have any other insights?
So we see a lot of trends going near sourcing again, and a lot of manufacturing also moving away from China. It has been before the case. So we were discussing one of our last episodes, because obviously other countries are getting less expensive, and manual labor, especially when it comes to painting small parts and producing small parts, has been too expensive in China for some time now. Now also we see the political aspect, and we see that China is becoming more of a risk market. So it's more like the Western companies have a better expected value if they basically go for near sourcing, which might be more expensive for the product on its own, but less risk. So the overall expected value when you calculate the risk is might be less. So obviously, supply chains are becoming more multi-domestic, more regional, which is an interesting trend. And I mean, what do you think, Betty, about the supply chain effect? I mean, you already did some. We discussed that last time, and you did some reading on that. So, what do you think about supply chain effects and the lockdown effects? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I've talked to some people here in Shanghai and also read an article about what the trends are for EU companies in the EU to like what where they are heading or what their thoughts are on like let's say after the pandemic. And there's definitely a trend towards divestment, or let's put it that way, like placing new investments in other areas. So not focusing too much on China in the future with new investments, but like maybe considering other markets in the future that they hadn't considered before. So, like, divesting is like we discussed that last time. I think divestment is also a trend, but for certain industries.
Mm.
Divestment is always a bit, has two sides, right? There are two sides of the coin because obviously China remains a very important market. So, you still want to be on the ground, you will still want to sell your products here. And, but definitely you need to, as you said it, Kimo, you need to, yeah, lower the risk in the future to be less dependent on geopolitical situations. We have like the outstanding decision on Taiwan or the outstanding development in Taiwan still, and like people are also preparing for the worst case here. And diversifying is not always like diversifying the supply chain is not always easy because many of the like components always like also come from China. So some of the industries are dependent on sourcing in China, and there's sometimes no good alternatives. But definitely new investments as like where the headquarters should be. It's definitely a bit dependent like on the future development.
I mean, you can even see it with big companies like Tesla, who estimated to miss out on 10,000 vehicles produced this quarter, and then of the lockdown, back only 70% of capacity. And you can see that nearly 60% of European business in the country said they were cutting 2022 revenue projection as a result of the COVID controls, according to a survey that occurred late last year by the UE Chamber of Commerce in China. So we see a
Yeah.
lot of effects there. Yeah.
Yeah, what many few people also investigate is the closed loop management that we had here in
Mm.
China, which many of the factories conducted, but some don't know that like there were different phases of the lockdown. So in the first phase, like if you consider the Shanghai lockdown, only the Chinese businesses that were crucial for operation, like gas, electricity companies, like some of the investment businesses in Shanghai, etc., they were actually able to continue operations in closed loop management, meaning that workers could sleep and live in the factories. They were not allowed to go out, but in this like with this setup, they were allowed to just continue. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this wasn't actually put in place for international companies or the other businesses that were not crucial at that time. And even after that, when they slowly reopened, like closed loop meant like 45% of capacity, and later like the international companies in their factories, they are still not up to 100% capacity yet. Most are running at 70% capacity, so there's definitely big delays, and that's becoming a big problem for most.
Yeah, and let's for a second talk about the human cost of all of that. I mean, Kevin Francis, we discussed it already about the crazy framing that the U.S. news put on it, and says like, okay, Shanghai has been the biggest prison camp in human history. It was all the city, 25 million residents locked in. So, what's your perspective like from a human cost perspective, especially as you mentioned, the elderly pay the highest toll on that.
I mean, that's a really good point, Kimo. Personally, I think given their position right now, I don't think they have any other choice but to lock down China simply because of the number of unvaccinated elderly people there are. as a proportion to the population. So clearly, right now they're trying to pivot their strategy to more towards health. I think the primary reason for this is because China's economy is primarily human capital driven, unlike German countries or the US, for instance, which is more based on technology.
Mm-hmm.
I think human capital is still a huge part of their economy, especially in the near term, and that's why they're trying to protect as many citizens as possible, and hence why newspapers, US citizens, and foreigners may look at this as incredibly draconian. I don't necessarily share the same opinion. What they're trying to do is buy as much time as possible in order to vaccinate those very vulnerable people to ensure that they're safe, to ensure that their economy is going to grow in the near and long terms.
Yeah, yeah. But like we also have this problem in the West already. Like I mean, it's just worse in China at the moment. Loneliness among the elderly, because of the
Mhm.
demographic change in the West. We have loneliness in general because of teleworking, right? Because of the new normal, yeah. And now this people have been locked in for 2 months. I mean, could you
Mhm.
imagine being locked in for 2 months? And especially like imagine like the Foxconn workers who have been like on the line doing their mundane job, and now they basically have to also sleep at the factory, so there's nothing they to look forward to at the end of their shift. And some of them actually went so nuts, they just ran out of the factory, like quit their job, like that's what they did, right? Because when they leave the building, they're fired more or less. The boss says, okay, you stay. If you
Mhm.
leave, you're fired. So they just took it. It's like, okay, they have no job. They have no job lined up. They just go so crazy from a psychological perspective, and they're just like, okay, I climb the fence. I can't take it anymore. I want to see my family. I mean,
Mhm.
we can't imagine something like that in the West, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also a difference in culture. So Chinese culture tends to be a lot more communicative, cooperative, whilst Western culture tends to be more individualistic. So I
Right.
think Asian countries in general are going to be a lot more resilient to this kind of treatment in comparison to maybe, Western or US countries, for the US in particular. So I think you've got to take it from that perspective too.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I haven't touched upon is really their healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
So I think another part of why China is locking down is they want to protect their healthcare system, simply
Yes.
because they don't have the capacity to, they don't have the number of beds, they have a low number of doctors relative to the population, and hence why they want to protect the healthcare system as much as possible so that can be allocated to treating other diseases like cancer, for instance, which is incredibly common in China. This is something that U.S. news doesn't really pick up upon, is and also the way that the healthcare system is structured. So the healthcare system is structured by it being centralized. So even though if you live in rural areas, you would still have to go into the city in order to get medical care. And what this does is that it puts so much strain on the capacity of these hospitals, particularly in cities. So in my opinion, what China needs to do is they need to build up their healthcare system, particularly in rural areas. Two, the doctor training is very good, by the way, especially in the city. But in
Mm-hmm.
rural
Is
areas,
it?
the average training for doctors is around 4 years, which
Hmm.
is below average relative to other countries. So hence why these patients they'd have to travel from a very long way away just to go into this central hospital, and this is causing so much strain on their healthcare system. And that's why I think a lockdown to some extent is somewhat justified simply because of this.
Now, Kevin Francis, you mentioned one thing which I would like to follow up upon, which is the collaborative approach in China. And this is completely true. What I'm observing here is still that people who lost their jobs, who had to return to their home country in the country, hometowns in the countryside, for example, they now are really just desperate. There's like the unemployment rate has raised a lot. um, I think it's about like 16% right now. I'm not sure about the exact number, but it's incredibly high. And like what many people don't understand is like when you are locked inside for 2 months, it's like the salaries aren't paid. Many salaries aren't paid. It's just not
Mm.
like going on. And what you also had in Shanghai is that during the lockdown, you basically couldn't purchase food, you couldn't purchase
Right.
drinking water in the beginning, and then what happened is that you had to organize yourselves in group, like in group buys. So you had to
Mm.
find new ways to purchase food and drinks with your neighbors, and that meant that prices, these things couldn't be delivered. So everybody added onto the normal prices, which meant that some of the supplies were like 5 times more expensive than before.
Oh,
It was
wow.
it was insane. So it was really
Mm.
like you spend so much more money, and like if you have a very low income job and you're not paid anymore, you still have to pay your rent. You have to purchase food, and it's 5 times more expensive than before. It's
Right.
just not. It's that something that puts so much pressure on you. It makes you so anxious and so desperate that at some point there was a shift towards people not supporting what was happening anymore, and all these like scenes in the city center where people were shouting, we're starving, we need food, we need drinks, we need to go out, we need medication. And now this is all over, and there was a big celebration of the um the victory over COVID, and like the new era after this lockdown. But you can still feel that people, they are very cautious now. They are
Mhm.
very they're a bit shocked still that this could happen in Shanghai. You know that there will be the big election of re-election of Xi Jinping in October for the third term, if that goes through, which likely will. But then like the system lives of the support and the collaborative approach. And yeah, it's very interesting to see how this is going to develop. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just coming back to that point, you said that basically people like group together and like buying groups and to get food for a reasonable price because it was such a price hike. I talked to like friends of mine in also in Shanghai, and they said basically, okay, the government delivered food basically also for free. So, but you had a personally different experience that.
It was basically for 4 weeks or so. There was no deliveries, normal deliveries possible. So everybody had to organize themselves in their
Mm,
compounds with their neighbors. So and do the group buys, and they were so insanely expensive.
shit.
So if you were running low on supplies, there was no alternative. And the governmental package, they were optimized for one person household. So like or maybe two, but it was not enough to actually fill up
It's
the
not
whole
enough.
family if you are more people. So
Right.
yeah, it's there's different experiences, and you know that many of the workers are living in very very small apartments. There's no space to move hardly. They were
Yes.
locked
Mhm.
inside. And well, I'm living in a house here, so this is like a completely other different situation with a garden. So that we have a completely different experience of the lockdown situation.
So what about the investments into China? So what are you saying? How will they change? Would the investment be affected by the lockdown long term, especially in the VC and CVC?
Yeah, like this is very interesting because there has been a CIMK study recently. CIMK is a startup in Nanjing, and they conducted a survey with the German newspaper Handelsblatt, and they found that overall the number of companies founded in those 18 largest cities fell by 13%.
Mm.
And this is actually like a big decline. In the three cities, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, nearly 30% fewer companies were registered compared to the previous year. And the like in Shanghai, which is the economic metropolis, half as many companies were founded as in the previous year. So there is a decline. And what is also interesting is that Beijing is benefiting from it. So there
Mm,
seems to be a move of like new company formations from these big cities to Beijing. And there's no real answer to this yet, but experts think that it might be because Beijing offers some more certainty, because obviously it's the governmental center, so they make sure that Beijing is always looking good, and that Beijing and its economy isn't affected by lockdowns too much, so they can basically navigate it differently as they deem it right. So more certainty there. Then there's also many VC companies in Beijing, and obviously like the VC partners were also restricted from traveling to other tier cities by the lockdowns and the COVID situation, and all this adds up to this trend.
I have a really good question for you, Chemo. So, obviously, with oil prices rising and with fuel prices rising everywhere worldwide, so I'm really curious to know your opinion on the EV sector in China, particularly in batteries, given that you have expertise in that field. It'd be nice to gain some, more in detailed insights into that.
Yeah, I think the EV sector in China is a very important market for China. And especially you see with the 14th five-year plan, China puts a big emphasis on the development of electric batteries and also manufacturing cars. We've seen, for example, that China, and I mean also India, they're now hiking ahead and actually being more competitive compared to Tesla. And I think that there still is a bright future, especially because of the very economic access to raw materials in China. So if I'm not completely mistaken, the demand in Europe is not going to be satisfied by what can be produced in Europe. So even if Europe wants to do more local supply chain, they're not even able to do that for batteries, and they need to source the core materials from China. And if Europe is not fast enough, CATL will open their plant in Germany, and probably also another country in Europe as well. And then they will basically be able to supply the European market efficiently with Chinese sourced and Chinese controlled production from a local manufacturing hub. And so I think China is not only an export business in the battery industry; it's also a subsidiary business. So basically, they're opening subsidiaries in Europe, and they have economies of scale due to the increased procurement function, right? Because they can buy cheaper as a whole company. And what is even more interesting, that they're actually subsidized by the government, so they have an unfair advantage. This is not only the case for battery, this is also the case for anything else on the China's 5-year plan.
I can also imagine that I'm not sure how human capital driven, the battery and the manufacturing segments of these batteries are, but I would imagine that I would imagine that these lockdowns would have some kind of tangible effect potentially in the short term.
So what you can see basically in the short term, we can see that Tesla estimated to miss out on about 10,000 vehicles, as I mentioned, to produce this quarter, and the lockdown, so back to only 70% capacity. And I think that is also due to what happens in China at the moment, like mainly. And then you can see it for other companies. I mean, CATL, you see BYD, and you see NIO, for example, have the same problems that due to the lockdown, not every company were able to have this closed loop manufacturing. And so many companies that produced in China have this problem that they have basically less capacity than they would like to have. But I don't think that many companies really have an advantage here, because most companies do produce in China. And so you only have like a less severe impact by a few percent. Everybody's affected, right? So everybody's affected, and nobody really says like, okay, we really produce just locally, for example. I mean, probably like Volvo is a bit more producing locally, but they're also in China. I know that. So I don't think anybody really has like an advantage here over the Chinese companies, and everybody has kind of lost on production capacity due to the Shanghai lockdown. But many companies are thinking about now, do you want to take this risk again? Because when it hits hard. So production of locally, and for example, recycling, especially if you look at like batteries you just talked about, is very important. That you go like, okay, maybe we're not going like sourcing new materials from China and then in production. Maybe we're going to recycle our batteries locally and be able to have this process in the West, in Europe, for example, in the US, when we talk about the US, and have this process basically not like virgin materials anymore. And I think this is also good for the environment trend that we basically see, okay, this might actually fuel the recycling closed loop supply chains, basically. And I think this is a positive thing. I mean, the lockdown has been bad for humans, but more or less good for the environment. Less pollution, more like less global supply chains, which sounds like, okay, you have less interesting things like happening. The world is less interconnected. But you see, from a sustainability perspective, global supply chains are not that good, actually. Yeah? Yeah, maybe the last topic we can talk about to finish that up. So what do you think is gonna be like the future direction for this lockdown? Did China like learn from what they did wrong, or is China gonna repeat this mistake basically? Because they are so proud of what they did and how it's sold in China, probably like as a win, or is it actually being more objective? Okay, so okay, we might have messed up here.
Well, I think it's I'm not sure if learning is the right approach, if the government learned from it or not. I think they know exactly what they do. It's just there was one theory about the Shanghai lockdown, that it happened because like it somehow fell together with the Olympic Games, right, in Beijing. And some of the like first cases had appeared during that time of the Olympic Games in Beijing, so they had to somehow keep quiet to not interfere, like to keep that a happy event, right? So they try to find other approaches to, like with the there was like this flexible testing. Like they didn't want to lock down the whole city from the very beginning. They didn't want to put too many people in quarantine. They wanted to keep it more flexible and see like, and there were basically tested new strategies to keep the Olympic spirit up. But then like numbers exploded and then there was no time left, so they really had to put drastic measures in place. Whereas in other cities they didn't have that kind of situation. And Beijing, for example, now they are very quick, and they like, because they after Shanghai went into lockdown, there was also new cases in Beijing, and they also had these mass testing rounds, and they also had to like somehow like not to make the same mistakes and not to wait for too long. And they it all worked, right? It worked in Shenzhen, it worked in Beijing, it worked in many other cities so far. I think the two drastic cases were Shanghai and Wuhan. And obviously, nobody wants this like Shanghai lockdown situation again, because that was really a lot of people lost face, or China lost face with
Yes.
this big lockdown. But in general, if you look at the other cities and how it's going, how it's done right now, we have to do PCR tests every second day. And like our green code that we have to show if we enter restaurants, or if we want to go like to public spaces like swimming pools or whatever, shopping malls. This is related to our PCR test, and if everything's fine, we can move around freely, and everything opens up. And this is how it works in other cities too. And I think with this, and they have all the data, they can actually like just monitor you all the time. And with that in place, I think they can actually just continue with this approach for a long time. Obviously, they always need to be quick, so they're even quicker with separating also close contacts and locking down compounds again if they find somebody who could be affected. But yeah, I think they, as Kevin Francis, as you said before, it will be difficult to change their strategy like quickly, because it's just the healthcare system isn't prepared. And there's also one effect. If you have no cases or hardly any cases in your country, how are you going to motivate the people to get vaccinated, right? So vaccination campaigns are still slow. So still not many people are getting vaccinated, not enough. So they just need to win time. They need to, and there's also first estimations that this is going to be, they are going to pursue this strategy until the mid of next year. But they are also opening up a bit when it comes to inbound travel. So people flying in from other countries, they're considering to change quarantine times, etc. So this is a trend. But yeah, no more changes expected
Yeah, I
right
mean,
now.
as you mentioned, this despite the negative image of the lockdown, China wants to keep its GDP growth, and they kind of want to transition to from a developing country to be a developed country, get a seat at the table, being more than just a manufacturing country, but also being an innovation country. And I mean, I think they took a major blow with what they did, like they lost face, as you said, but still, I think. If they show basically that China can be trusted in their supply chains again, and they basically know how to handle the situation, the future might still be bright. Kevin Francis, do you have some closing words from your side to close
I
this
think there is
podcast topic?
I think there is some bullish sentiment from my side, because the way that a virus works is that, yes, of course, it's going to get more transmissible, but it's not going to become too transmissible, if that makes sense. Like, because if a virus mutates too quickly, what happens is that its genetic makeup actually breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a point, an equilibrium, where a virus will stop reproducing faster than what it actually did in the past. So, in my opinion, from what I've seen from scientific papers, China in particular is actually becoming more targeted in the way that they've done lockdown. So, previously during Wuhan, they locked down Wuhan and the surrounding areas. But the scientific papers have actually shown that over time, China is actually beginning to learn. So these lockdowns are becoming more targeted. They're becoming more targeted in terms of the region of the town, the region of the city, maybe even a particular neighborhood, and they're becoming faster to respond over time. Now, the virus isn't going to become any more transmissible than what it is right now, in my opinion. I think it's possibility it can a little bit, but it won't be as quick to increase in transmissibility as it did from 2 years ago to what it is now, if that makes sense. So I can actually see a potential light in the tunnel for China. And during this time, they should certainly build up their hospitals, especially in the rural areas. And that way they can alleviate a lot more capacity. They can spread it across a larger area. And on top of that, because they're vaccinating consistently, especially among the vulnerable, I can see I can see this being as a potential solution in the short and long term. Um, but yeah, I think China has a huge vested interest right now, and it's a real pivoting point because they've got to transition from a human-driven economy to a more technological-driven economy, and I think they can certainly do that from my side.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these closing words. Nothing to add.